All right, everyone, I'm going to start us off. So hello, thank you for joining today's Health Effects Institute webinar on cumulative impacts. My name is Yasmin Ramidi, and I'm a staff scientist here at HEI. So first, I'm going to acknowledge my co-organizers at HEI and thank all our wonderful speakers and our moderator for joining us. Thank you to all of you for joining us today. Before I turn it over to our moderator and we delve into the webinar, I'm going to make a few housekeeping announcements and then talk a little bit about the Energy and Health Program at HEI and the project that this webinar series is supporting specifically. So in terms of logistics, all attendees are muted with no audio for the duration of the webinar. You can turn on closed captioning for the event at the bottom of your screen. This is to the right of the Q&A button. If you have any questions at any point during the webinar, please also submit them through the Q&A function. The webinar is going to be recorded and posted on our website afterwards. So if you have to drop off at any point, that's okay. And also, if you have any logistical difficulties, please send a message to us through the Q&A function as well. All right, so just a little bit about HEI and the Energy and Health Program at HEI. We're an independent nonprofit corporation chartered to provide policy-relevant, high-quality, and impartial science on the potential human population exposures and health effects from onshore development of oil and natural gas from shale and other unconventional resources across the United States. We're funded jointly by government and the oil and natural gas industry, as well as occasionally some private foundations. And the way the program works is we fund research that is selected, conducted, overseen, and reviewed independently of these sponsors. So this work is overseen by both the Energy Research Committee and the Energy Review Committee, both of which are comprised of internationally recognized experts in one or more of the topics relevant to this research program. So about the special project, so this is a special project that's being undertaken by the Energy and Health Program. We are going to design a cumulative impact assessment for a representative community in the United States experiencing oil and gas extraction and production. So I've listed the formal objectives here on the slide, but I'm not going to read them word for word. You know, the basic gist is the purpose of this project is really to help support decision-making about how best to ensure the protection of public health. And the design for this cumulative impact assessment is going to incorporate consideration of both chemical and non-chemical stressors from the built, natural, and social environments and how they might benefit or adversely affect health. The project is going to be or is being overseen by a special panel who I've listed here, each of whom has diverse experience and expertise that is relevant to this project. And ultimately, the project is going to undergo external peer review and discussion at a public event. Now, in terms of the webinar, so this is the second webinar in a multi-part educational series that we're co-organizing with HEI's Environmental Justice Program in support of this special project. If you missed the first webinar, which was back in February, that was basically summarizing the basics about cumulative impacts and cumulative impact assessment, and you can watch that recording on our website. This is the second webinar, and it's going to highlight projects that exemplify elements of a cumulative impact assessment that have been implemented across different geographic scales and with very specific objectives. And then in June, we're going to host a third webinar, which is going to focus on the specific methodologies that have and can be used in cumulative impact assessment. Okay, and so with that, I'm going to introduce our moderator, Dr. Stephanie Malin. She's a special panel member and she's an associate professor of sociology at Colorado State University. Her research interests include environmental justice, health and governance in extractive communities, as well as communities building more distributive and regenerative economies and systems. She utilizes primarily qualitative fieldwork methods in rural and peripheral regions in the US, and she works to build relationships with community partners. Stephanie is the co-founder and co-director of the Center for Environmental Justice at Colorado State University, where she also teaches undergraduate and graduate courses on this topic. She's also an active affiliate of the Colorado School of Public Health, School for Global Environmental Sustainability, and the Colorado Water Center. And her most recent book, Building Something Better, Environmental Crises and the Promise of Community Change, with Megan Elizabeth Coleman, was released in 2022. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing and you can take it away, Stephanie.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Yasmin. Thank you all for having me, and thank you all for being here today. I am going to introduce our first speaker to get us off on the right foot, keep us on schedule. We hope you enjoy the event. Our first speaker is Dr. Leona Scanlon. Leona is a staff toxicologist, and she's been working at California's Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment since 2022. She has conducted risk assessment of environmental contaminants for the state of California since 2016. Her career focuses on how environmental contaminants affect the health of humans and the environment. Dr. Scanlon currently conducts human health risk assessment of air contaminants in disadvantaged communities near oil and gas facilities in California. So we are starting off with a very experienced and knowledgeable panelist. So thank you, Dr. Scanlon, for being here, and you can take it away.
Great, thank you so much. It's great to be here. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, can you guys see this presentation?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. All right, welcome everyone. I'm sorry I have a bit of a cold. Today, I'm going to tell you about some work that we did at a location called Lost Hills, California. This work involved cumulative risk assessment, and it's part of a program called Study of Neighborhood Air Near Petroleum Sources, also known as SNAPS. So I wanted to start by acknowledging that this work was a massive collaboration that included members of the Lost Hills community, the California Air Resources Board, and the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment. While I'm the person here presenting, this is the work of many people. Notably, the Lost Hills community has been instrumental in the development of the SNAPS program. We engaged with the community through a number of in-person community meetings, odor reporting phone lines, incorporation of feedback, and one-on-one calls. I want to specifically thank the Lost Hills residents, the Lost Hills Committee, the Central California Environmental Justice Network, the Clean Water Fund, and the Central California Asthma Collaborative. I would also like to note that this risk assessment work was performed by doctors Heather Bolstad and Rachel Hirani. So here is an outline of what I will talk about today. We will start with the SNAPS community selection process. This is where we most actively considered non-chemical stressors. Then we will briefly get into the air measurements and source apportionment. Next, we will get into the risk assessments. Finally, I want to talk a little about our next steps. And at this point, I would also like to let you know that all of this information is available in the SNAPS Lost Hills draft report, which is available online. Excuse me. So SNAPS community selection was a three-step process. In the first step, we identified communities that were near oil or gas wells. I'm going to try to put my little laser pointer on. There we go. Okay. We also took public suggestions and air district suggestions for additional communities. The second step was location evaluation. We considered a total of 8 variables, which included well density, the CalEnviro screen score, initial sampling results, and the existence of community groups. This is where we were able to include non-chemical stressors in a cumulative impacts assessment. And I have a few slides coming up about this. Finally, the third step was the prioritization of the locations. This was a deeper dive into those 8 variables. And we also considered the logistics of installing equipment and sampling. We identified 56 candidate communities through our first community identification step. The evaluation and prioritization steps were then used to objectively narrow down that large number into the first 4 initial SNAPS communities. The first 4 communities are shown on this map of California. You can see they're located in Central California and also in Southern California. The first 4 communities are Lost Hills, this little red dot, Baldwin Hills down here, the McKittrick Derby Acres area, and then South Los Angeles. California has a lot of oil production. In 2019, it ranked 7th in the United States, and Lost Hills in 2019 was the 6th largest oil producing field in California. Okay, so now I want to give you a little information on the CalEnviroscreen analysis of chemical and non-chemical stressors. This CalEnviroscreen analysis was included in our site selection process, our community selection process. CalEnviroscreen is an environmental justice screening tool developed by OEHA to help identify California communities that are disproportionately burdened by multiple stressors or vulnerabilities. It assigns scores for chemical and non-chemical stressors at the census tract level, relative to other census tracts in California. For our SNAPS work, we used version 3, but version 4 is now available. And these are available online, free of charge. The CalEnviroscreen analysis considers both pollution burden, all of these variables, as well as population characteristics. Excuse me. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go into all of the 21 different indicators. But I want to point out that we consider the population characteristics as well as the pollution burden. Population characteristics include sensitive populations, such as incidence of asthma, cardiovascular disease, and low birth weight infants. It also includes socioeconomic factors, such as educational attainment, housing burden, linguistic isolation, poverty, and unemployment. This CalEnviroscreen analysis is how we were able to include cumulative impacts and ultimately environmental justice into our assessment. For Lost Hills, the CalEnviroscreen score was 87. This means that the census tract in Lost Hills has a higher burden than 87% of the rest of the state. Because this CalEnviroscreen score is greater than 75, Lost Hills is a designated disadvantaged community. On this slide, you can see an orange arrow pointing to a black dot. This is Lost Hills. The dot is located in a dark orange rectangular shape. This is the census tract. The color of the census tract indicates the burden level. Green and yellow indicate areas that have less burden, whereas red and orange have more burden. Some of the highest contributions to the overall CalEnviroscreen score included linguistic isolation, educational attainment, groundwater threats, solid waste sites, and poverty. This is an image of the area around Lost Hills. The Lost Hills community is inside this dashed line box. You can see the oil field is directly west. In collaboration with the Lost Hills community, we selected a stationary monitoring site represented by the red star that was about 1 mile away from the oil field. In addition to the oil field, there are other sources of potential pollution. These include natural gas distribution lines, mobile sources like cars and trucks, and agricultural and landfill facilities. This cumulative assessment therefore assessed cumulative inhalation risk from all possible sources. Excuse me. Once we identified and did extensive outreach and engagement with the Lost Hills community, we started taking measurements. We did a lot of monitoring over an 11-month period, which started in May 2019. Measurements included a stationary trailer with several stationary monitors, mobile monitors, and different discrete samples. We also looked at meteorology or weather, wind, air quality index, and we performed odor analyses. We monitored for over 200 pollutants. These included toxic air contaminants, volatile organic compounds, ozone, hydrogen sulfide, metals, glycols, methane, etc. Overall, we detected 108 different compounds in the air at Lost Hills. When we could, and following input from the community, we tried to figure out where pollution came from through source apportionment analysis or positive matrix factorization. Initial results vary by quarter and indicate that black carbon primarily came from mobile sources like cars and trucks. VOCs primarily came from oil and gas related sources. And BTEX, benzene, toluene, ethylene, and xylene, came from both mobile and oil and gas related sources. A very small percentage was estimated to be biogenic or occurring naturally. Once we had the measurements for pollutants in Lost Hills, we were able to perform a screening level human health risk assessment. For individual chemicals, risk was calculated as a hazard quotient, which is the measured concentration divided by a health guidance value, or level at which health effects are not expected. For acute scenarios, the hazard quotient was derived from the maximum air concentration detected for a single pollutant divided by that pollutant's acute health guidance value. We primarily used OEHA reference exposure levels, or RELs, as the health guidance values. When OEHA RELs were not available, we used values from other agencies, such as the US EPA. For chronic scenarios, the annual average air concentration was divided by a chronic health guidance value to determine the hazard quotients. Hazard quotients less than or equal to 1 were not expected to cause health effects. In other words, if the measured air concentration was below the health guidance value, health effects were not expected. Excuse me. In this slide, okay, I know this is busy. You can see the acute risk calculations for compounds detected at Lost Hills. Chemicals are listed along the horizontal axis here, and the risk calculation is on the vertical axis. This orange line indicates a hazard quotient of 1. Only acrolein and dimethyl disulfide were detected at levels high enough to result in a hazard quotient greater than 1. This means the probability of health effects occurring is greater for those two chemicals, and there is a risk of concern for acrolein and dimethyl disulfide following short-term exposures. For the chronic single chemical calculations, only one chemical, acrolein, resulted in a chronic hazard quotient greater than 1. This means the probability of health effects occurring is greater for acrolein, and there is a risk of concern. I would like to note that for the chronic and cancer scenarios, we filtered chemicals for detection frequency and did not include chemicals that were only detected once out of 20 to 50 samples for discrete samples, or those that had a detection frequency of less than 5% for compounds measured hourly. This is because, by definition, chronic exposure is repeated. Excuse me. Now, for the cumulative non-cancer risk assessment. The risk from different chemicals that target the same organ or systems can be combined to determine a cumulative risk. In this case, we took the sum of the hazard quotients for chemicals that acted on one system and determined a cumulative hazard index. I want to remind everyone that this is for inhalation risk only. Other pathways, that non-inhalation pathways, were not included at this time. So this graph shows risks of concern for the cumulative acute and non-cancer scenarios. The target organ systems are on the horizontal axis, and the vertical axis represents, the potential for health effects. There is a horizontal orange line here at 1. Below this, health effects are not expected. You can see the respiratory system and eyes. I don't know if you're seeing my little, sorry, okay, there we go. Both had the potential for health effects from short-term exposure to acrolein and dimethyl disulfide. So the risk for the respiratory system was driven by acrolein and dimethyl disulfide, where the risk for the eyes was driven by exposure to acrolein. Risks to other organ systems were all below 1. This graph shows the cumulative risks for the chronic exposure. So again, here we have the systems that were affected here on the horizontal axis, and then the hazard index here on the vertical axis. And you can see that risks, were sorry, I'm coughing a lot. Okay, here you can see the respiratory system and the nervous system have the potential for health effects from long-term exposures. Acrolein was the largest contributor to potential health effects in the respiratory system. Manganese, aluminum, benzene, and arsenic were the largest contributors to potential health effects over here in the nervous system. Risk to the other organ systems were below 1. All right. So now we're getting into the cancer risks for Lost Hills. I know this is a busy slide. Let me break it down. This slide estimates cancer risks for carcinogens that we evaluated. The carcinogens are listed on the vertical axis here, and the cancer risk, on the horizontal axis, and the cancer risk is on the vertical axis. Cancer risk is expressed as excess cases of cancer per million people exposed. Many compounds alone exceeded this 1 out of a million level of concern. Represented by the orange line. On the far left, individual cancer risks were summed to show the cumulative cancer risk of 710 cases out of 1 million people exposed. This number is high and of concern for the community. I want to note here that the diesel particulate matter risk is comparable to other areas of California and has gotten better over time with increased regulation. I would also like to note that this figure does not include acrolein, which was recently classified as a 2A probable human carcinogen by the international body IARC. We do not yet have a cancer potency factor for acrolein. So in the future, when a potency factor is developed, we can calculate that risk. All right, moving on to the next steps. We are currently incorporating public comments into our Lost Hills report. Once the final draft is released, the Lost Hills monitoring data will also become available. You may have noticed that acrolein came up in acute and chronic scenarios and is also considered a carcinogen. In addition, Acrolein can come from many possible sources, including combustion processes such as automobile and diesel exhaust, agriculture, photochemical reactions in the atmosphere, plants, and oil field operations. In response to public concern, we are therefore planning to perform additional monitoring to try to determine the potential acrolein source, and we are exploring the development of a cancer potency factor for acrolein. Finally, we have also started monitoring in communities near the Inglewood oil field in Southern California. This is our second SNAPS location. These monitoring data are available in real time on the CARB website, which I have on the next slide. So with that, I would like to thank you for your attention. Thank you, HEI, also for giving us this opportunity to present our work. My email is leona.scanlon@oeha.ca.gov if you have any questions. The Inglewood oil field data are available at the SNAPS data display website. And also, we are hiring for 2 positions that are related to this work at OEHA. The first is a cumulative risk research scientist 4. You can see this job code here. You can scan this QR code to go to all the jobs that are posted at OEHA right now. The other one is another toxicologist for the SNAPS program, also at OEHA. So thank you again, and I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Dr. Scanlon. That was a very interesting and important presentation. Just a reminder that we will be doing a full Q&A at the end after we hear from both of our panelists. And so I see some excellent questions in the Q&A already. Be sure to pop those in there if you have some that you'd like to see us address. We will do that after we hear from our second speaker, who is Katarina Kwon. Katarina is a PhD candidate in the School of Resource and Environmental Management at SFU. Her research group has an ongoing partnership with the Metlakatla First Nation to develop and implement a cumulative effects management, or CEM, program in their traditional territory on the north coast of British Columbia, Canada. She has been doing community-based research with the Metlakatla since 2014. Got that finally after practicing, right? Starting with her master's research on valued component selection and continuing with her PhD research on further advancing their CEM initiative, which again stands for Cumulative Effects Management. Katarina is particularly interested in examining how cumulative effects assessment and monitoring information can be effectively connected to decision-making processes for First Nations in British Columbia.
Thank you so much. I'm going to just share my screen here. Okay. All right. So thank you, HEI, for inviting us to give this presentation. I am joining from Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, which is on the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I'm going to be sharing some of my experience developing and implementing the Metlakatla Cumulative Effects Management Program with the Metlakatla First Nation. And so before I jump into that, I do want to acknowledge and thank the Metlakatla First Nation, its leadership, staff, and community members. This work would not be possible without their ongoing support, guidance, and contributions. I feel very lucky to be able to collaborate with Metlakatla on this project. So the Metlakatla Cumulative Effects Management Program, or CEM for short, started in 2014. And so we are really coming into our 10th year of work. As you can imagine, there's a lot of things that have happened in that time. And so I won't be able to go into a lot of details, and we'll probably be going through this very quickly. But for this presentation, I will start by introducing the Metlakatla First Nation and its territory, telling the story of why the program was created and how we started. I'll then provide a very brief overview of the program, so what it is and what we do, and I'll end with some reflections and lessons. I do want to mention we have a brand new website, so please check it out for more information. And from there, you can also download a copy of our synopsis report, which covers our work in more detail up to 2019. So the Metlakatla First Nation described themselves as a progressive Tsimshian community located in a highly productive environment on the north coast of British Columbia, Canada. Metlakatla means saltwater pass in Smalyak, which is the language of the Coast Tsimshian. They have about 1,000 members, and a majority of those members live within the traditional territory. So this is a map of Metlakatla's territory. It's about 20,000 square kilometers of land and sea in the Great Bear Rainforest on the north coast of BC. There are two major cities in the territory, Prince Rupert and Terrace. Metlakatla Village, which is marked by the little green marker on the map, is the main reserve community and is located about 5 kilometers from Prince Rupert, accessible only by boat. Like most of BC, Metlakatla's territory is unceded, so no treaties have been signed between the Government of Canada and Metlakatla. But Metlakatla is currently in the last stage of the modern treaty process in BC and is committed to achieving self-governance of its lands and people. So I want to share a little bit about the development context on BC's North Coast, which really set the stage for why the program was started. So starting in 2012, Metlakatla received project applications for multiple major projects, many of them related to LNG or liquefied natural gas. There were over 20 different projects being proposed in their territory, mainly in Prince Rupert and Kitimat. And so from 2012 to about 2017, we really focused on this potential LNG boom as an important source of impact on Metlakatla values. But soon after, we shifted our focus to port expansion. Many of the proposed LNG projects were canceled, but new smaller LNG projects are now in various stages of assessment. The port itself is undergoing expansion, mainly around propane and coal exports. CN is doubling the rail lines near Prince Rupert to accommodate all of this growth, and there's also been an increase in marine shipping activities. So at that time, in around 2012, 2013, Metlakatla leadership looked at all of this proposed activity in the territory and asked two important questions. What are the combined impacts of all these developments on our territory and people, and what are we doing to understand and manage those impacts? So the Metlakatla SEM program was created to not only understand cumulative effects in the region, but to figure out ways to respond to and manage those effects. So in 2014, the Metlakatla First Nation directed the Stewardship Society to look into this issue of cumulative effects. They brought together a team of staff, university researchers from Simon Fraser University, and experts to begin what is now the Metlakatla SEM program. So now I'm going to give, again, a very brief overview of the actual program, and I'll have a short example from one of the values that we've been working on. So just to start, these are really the images that we are probably the most familiar with when it comes to thinking of cumulative effects. And we often describe cumulative effects as the accumulation of changes to the environment or human well-being from past, present, and future projects and activities. And so I do want to share with you the way that we've come to talk about cumulative effects through engagement with the Metlakatla community. So cumulative effects is like how water ripples. One action, like dropping a stone in the water, can have lasting effects beyond that one action. These effects cause changes to the things we care about, our values, and are not just limited to the biophysical and environmental realm, but include important cultural and socioeconomic values. Everything is connected. So once we were able to establish a common understanding of cumulative effects with the community, how do we begin to tackle it? And so I do want to just take a quick aside here to talk a little bit about what Indigenous-led SEM is. So I would say that cumulative effects management is distinguished from cumulative effects assessment in that it links assessment information to decision-making by outlining specific mitigation and management strategies. And then these strategies are designed to prevent undesirable cumulative impacts to values. So some of the key features of Indigenous-led SEM are shown here, and this area is really growing in Canada and BC in particular. So Indigenous-led SEM really is a community-based strategic planning model for supporting Indigenous control at several scales. It's a proactive approach to managing impacts from development in a way that aligns with the community's goals for their territory, for their people, and their resources. And so that's where we started. We wanted to understand the SEM decision context, so how the SEM program and the information it produces could be used to support Metlakatla decision-making in many different areas. And so the question really was looking at the places where they might want to use the SEM program information. So in places such as environmental assessment response, land and marine planning, community planning, even participating in regional planning and policy processes that involve other levels of government and other Indigenous nations. And so for us, SEM is really a success as long as it is helping Metlakatla make decisions about things that matter to Metlakatla people. So to develop this framework, the key questions we asked were, where do these ideas come from and what is the framework grounded in? So the three things we have here is Metlakatla SEM is guided by Metlakatla's worldview, their principles and traditional knowledge. It's rooted in Metlakatla values, community members, staff, and leadership are involved in every step. And of course, Metlakatla SEM is informed by best practices, planning, impact assessment, and Indigenous governance. We also have three guiding principles. So the program must be culturally relevant. SEM is a program, not a project, which means it is really a long-term undertaking, and internal and external collaboration is necessary. So this is our framework for the SEM program. As I mentioned, cumulative effects management is a proactive approach to resource management and planning that focuses on values. It recognizes that a holistic long-range management perspective is needed to protect and manage these values. And so it monitors the condition of priority values. When the condition of these values worsen, it triggers management actions to respond. And so these are the four phases in our approach. So phase one, what does Metlakatla care about and want to manage? Phase two, what is the condition of Metlakatla's priority values? Phase three, when does Metlakatla start getting worried and decide to act or act more intensively? And then phase four, how does Metlakatla take action to manage values? And the final piece about the framework is that the SEM program is built around a values foundation. And so these are all the components of the values foundation. We have our 5 pillars, which are cultural identity, governance, environment, economic prosperity, and social health. And under that, we have a list of values that we focus on, indicators to measure them, an understanding of the current condition and future trend, a broad desired goal, and then tiered management triggers and actions. And so I'm going to try to quickly go through the 4 phases and give an example at the end. Again, I apologize for not being able to provide a lot of details. So starting with phase 1, identifying and selecting priority values. So we developed a method that first identifies which values are the most important to Metlakatla and then prioritizes those values based on mandate, ability to influence, capacity, and priority. And so Metlakatla in 2014-2015 identified 10 priority values. And with direction from leadership, we started with 4 pilot values, which are food, social, and ceremonial activity, butter clams, housing, and employment. In phase 2, assessing the current condition of those values, one of the things that we recognized early on was a general lack of Metlakatla specific data. And so on the socioeconomic front, we decided to fill that gap by developing the Metlakatla membership census. And so this census has been successfully administered from 2015 to 2017, in 2020 and in 2022. And so our plan is to do the census every 2 years. On the environmental values, we are also developing a monitoring program for butter clams and other bivalves. And so clam population surveys have been conducted from starting in 2017 and are continuing this year and for the next 2 or 3, 4 years on multiple beaches in Metlakatla's territory. And this data will really help us estimate the condition of butter clam populations. And the plan is really to survey as many beaches as possible to increase our spatial understanding of clam populations in the territory. And as part of this, we're also collecting data on contaminants and water quality, which are important stressors for clams. And then phase 3, which is setting tiered management triggers and actions. So this is a really central feature of the SEM program. And it's the idea of setting limits on impacts to values and also having early warning signals before critical thresholds are crossed. And the triggers are really there to provide Metlakatla decision makers with clear information about when and what kind of action will be taken to manage priority values. And so we've created a process with Metlakatla to set triggers for 3 of our values. So FSC activity, housing, and butterclams, and we plan to expand that with the next set of values that we focus on. And then the last piece that has a lot of components to it, which is developing the actual strategies. It's really the culmination of all the work that's been done through the program and by other departments at Metlakatla to really give us a good understanding of how we should be managing these values in the long term. And so that's kind of the overview of the program and the different phases. And I'll just give an example from the butterclam value of what this looks like on the ground. So for phase 1, this is when butterclams were selected as a priority value. It's measured by population density. Some of the key stressors that we've identified are contaminants, harvest, and habitat. And these are also things that we're tracking through the program. And so as I mentioned, for phase 2, we're collecting clam population data through those clam surveys. Habitat data will be collected starting this summer, and contaminant data collection is ongoing. We were able to set management triggers for this value. And so through a series of workshops, the community set these 2 levels. So the point at which the community is worried is when there's a greater than 20% reduction. And then the sort of no-go zone or critical zone is when there's greater than 40% reduction. And then finally, to develop a long-term strategy, some of the things that we're focused on are collecting data on stressors to better understand how clams are impacted. And we're also looking at clam gardens as a way to restore clam beaches using traditional practices. And so we're just flying through. I'm going to talk a little bit about some reflections and lessons from our work over the last 10 years or so. So we really had an opportunity to meet with other communities, particularly other Indigenous communities doing cumulative effects work or wanting to do this type of work, and shared some of the things that we've learned along the way. So I'm just going to share 3 today. The first is, it is really important to take the time to develop a framework and process. So for your cumulative effects program, having a roadmap to guide the work ensures that everyone involved is on the same page. So understanding what cumulative effects means to your community, how do you plan to address cumulative effects, that's always going to be different depending on your community's goals. But the challenge is getting everyone on the same page, getting that community buy-in is slow but necessary. So we use a range of engagement methods to meet community members where they are. And every year we see more and more participation from the community on our activities. And this is really important because community members keep us accountable. The second is we know that tackling cumulative effects can feel daunting. There's lots to learn and understand, and there are hundreds of values that are important to every community, including Metlakatla. So we really recommend starting with a few values to test methods and approaches, but to have a plan to build from there. Starting small also allows you to work within existing resources and capacity. But obviously the challenge is building long-term capacity and resources is difficult. So we had graduate students from SFU work on STEM projects, and that's been an amazing source of capacity for the program. But hiring core staff and securing multi-year operational funding is really important for the sustainability of the program, and we're still really sorting those pieces out. And then the third is make use of STEM data and information. I think a lot of the times we focus a lot on collecting the information and collecting the data without a plan for how that data should be used and can be used effectively. And so this is, again, just an area that we're really focused on, but there is always going to be concerns about data sharing and confidentiality, especially when it means sharing data with government or with proponents and other groups. And so I think one of the reasons why we've been able to find success in the Metlakatla program is because Metlakatla leadership enabled the STEM program beyond the mandate of any one organization to allow the team to explore a broad range of values and to find equally broad solutions. And just to mention that the work is still growing, and we have been able to hire full-time staff and have some core funding for the program. And so if you have any questions, please check out our website or contact me or the STEM program manager, Jean. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Katarina. It looks like we have some excellent questions in the Q&A, so I will start with those for both of you. I'll start with one question that is addressed to both of you equally, I would say. How do you manage industry's need to make decisions and move quickly, and the fact that the underlying science and finding answers about cumulative impacts takes time? Of course, that was said during webinar 1. That's when the question popped up, but I think this really relates to both, right? So kind of maybe the tension between industry's pace and scale and the necessary time that needs to be invested into measuring these cumulative impacts well. Katerina, maybe if you want to go first, just since you were just talking, not to put you on the spot, and then Dr. Scanlon, if you wouldn't mind following up, that would be lovely.
I think that's a really good question, and it's a really big challenge for communities like Metlakatla and other Indigenous communities. You know, constantly being asked to participate at the timelines and the processes that are being led by government or proponents. And it's actually one of the reasons why the Metlakatla decided to start the SEM program, because at the time there was just nobody doing anything to address the issue of cumulative effects, and yet they were getting proposal after proposal for projects that were being that people wanted to build in their territory. And so the SEM program is really about kind of separating from those external processes and those state-led or proponent processes, and trying to understand sort of what Metlakatla can do to protect values that are important to them. So I would say almost like our approach has been to not really participate in those processes, but to say, you know, the reason why we're able to do that is because Metlakatla has a really robust environmental assessment department, and you know they are committed to obviously participating in EAs and impact assessments and other things that proponents are a part of, and will make requests to us to share data, and we kind of leave it to them to figure out how to strategize around sharing data when it can be shared. So yeah, it's a bit challenging for us because we've kind of decided to separate ourselves a little bit from those external processes.
Thank you, Katerina. I have a follow-up for you, but I'll put a pin in that until we hear from Leona an answer to that question.
Hi, thank you. So I think this question comes up a lot, right? And, you know, my kind of quick answer is, well, I'm a scientist. I don't manage anything. But the reality is in the state government, we have to take time to do our work. And at this level, at my level, I don't have to take into consideration the industry's needs, but at other levels, that will come into consideration. And I would like to actually bring in some of my colleagues who may better be able to answer this question. Maybe Kathleen or Alvaro.
Yes, thank you, Leona. That reminds me too. I was supposed to let you all know that Leona's colleagues from OEHA and the California Air Resources Board may help us answer questions. So if you want to jump in from those groups, please, you are more than welcome to. Please just introduce yourselves as you're telling us a little bit about your response to these questions. Thank you.
I can definitely start off, and Alvaro, if you want to chime in, please feel free to do so. I'm Kathleen Kozawa with the California Air Resources Board, and thanks for having us here today. So just to kind of add on to Leona's question, and I'll concur and echo, just these are questions that come up very often in terms of the research space as well, because oftentimes there is kind of a disconnect between the time it takes to do this kind of work and research, and then when those the findings are needed, because industry needs to know. I think in terms of the SNAPS program for the state of California, it is kind of folded into a larger state effort in terms of oil and gas to phase it out, right? We're going toward decarbonizing our economy, like generally speaking. And so this really is a key, just one part of kind of the assessment. And so I just wanted to add, I guess I just wanted to add that perspective, that it is part of a larger effort where industry is involved in the discussions kind of at these like higher levels. So
I would like to add that we also, you know, we're not just considering industry, we're very closely working with communities and considering the community needs and trying to adjust our actions to meet their requests and their timelines as well. When possible, of course.
Thank you so much. Does anyone else want to chime in on that question? Okay, I had a little follow-up myself that also echoes a couple of the questions that are in the chat. In terms of the Metlakatla's approach for our second presenter, the question that we have in the chat is, for the SEM work, is there a specific instance where this work influenced a specific decision? My more general question too was, have the Metlakatla had a seat at the table? Have they really constructed the table and invited people to it to discuss these issues, since this, these are their ancestral lands? Just wondering a little bit, Katerina, you told us a little bit, right, about not necessarily directly participating in those processes. But if you could elaborate a little bit on that, that would be terrific. Thank you.
Yeah, there's lots of examples that I can definitely share. So one that's so as I mentioned, a lot of the work that we're doing is about Metlakatla's internal management of these values. And so one of the key values that was identified early on was housing. And I'm not sure what the situation is where everyone is, but in BC in particular, housing is in a critical state. A lot of members in Prince Rupert are in core housing need. And so while people knew that housing was an issue, and I think when the SEM program started collecting data and information about the housing situation was really when it solidified for Metlakatla leadership and other groups that are working in the Prince Rupert region. And so one of the things that it's really led to is actually Metlakatla deciding to build its own housing. So they partnered with BC Housing, which is a housing organization in our province, and they built a seniors housing unit in Prince Rupert, and that was open to everyone who lived in Prince Rupert that is, over 65 years old. But what that housing project was able to do was actually pull almost all of the Metlakatla elders that were living in Prince Rupert that we had found to be in core housing need out of core housing need, just by the fact that it was affordable housing that was safe and all of the other conditions that are that we're trying to meet around the housing value. So I would say that's like a very clear kind of connection. And then we've also done a lot of other work related to that in terms of bringing people to the table to talk about housing, because housing is one of those things where Metlakatla really can't do it on their own. So we had the first meeting between Metlakatla Chief and Council and the City of Prince Rupert Mayor and Council that they've ever had on anything, and specifically talking about housing and how they can work together, and MOUs have been signed, and obviously that work is ongoing and long term. In terms of impact assessment, we've also, because of the work that we're doing on different values, is how we've highlighted those issues to proponents. So especially a lot of the cultural and socioeconomic values, proponents are less open to considering in terms of their impacts on those things. And now, before the SEM program, I would say like housing and those kinds of topics were never included in an impact assessment, and now it's always there. How is your project going to impact housing situations for members living in Prince Rupert? Because now we know those effects pathways a lot better. And then the last thing that I'll say is there's I would say the north coast of British Columbia has a lot of the work that's happening around cumulative effects, especially Indigenous led. And there are several regional initiatives that Metlakatla is a part of with other nations. And our framework has really been relied upon to build frameworks for these other programs. And so we always say that like it's an opportunity to really raise the bar for resource management in an area when you develop a program like this. And so that's something that we're also really proud of, and to see kind of growing in at least our region of the province.
Thank you so much. That was an excellent example. It's really important to see that ideas of measurement, right, and conceptualization are so foundational, right, and how those are influencing other decision making. So that's excellent. Thank you so much, Katerina. I'm trying to Dr. Scanlon, I see you answering one of the questions I was going to ask. So we will, I'll go to one that's kind of more general for both of you. From Julia Haggerty, were industry representatives engaged in these assessments and management plans? And if so, what lessons would you share from that? So what was the level of engagement of industry representatives and lessons learned?
Hi. So industry was engaged as they are part of the community there in Lost Hills. And I'd like to ask if Kathleen or Jonathan has more to add. But so industry was involved in that they attended meetings and had definitely had chance to submit comments to us as well.
Thank you, Leona. Does anyone else want to jump in and add any more detail to that about the California context? Katerina, did you, I want to save space for folks, so feel free to still jump in if you, yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Hi, Jonathan Blufer with the California Air Resources Board. Yeah, just to go off what Leona said, absolutely. Industry was involved. I would say, we tried to, make everyone an equal seat at the table for this project. So, during our community meetings, there were a lot of residents, but there were industry representatives that were there also providing comments and feedback throughout the process. They were also involved in providing us some data for the report as well. And so they did provide us some data on like well stimulation events, workover events, and things like that we include in our analysis. So yeah, they were absolutely involved and informed of the meetings, just like the community was.
And to address the lessons learned, I think this is common for most of our lessons when working with communities in general, is that we're learning to be more transparent and to be, a little more precise with what we say, to better enable understanding of our work.
Thank you, Leona. Katerina, did you want to chime in with anything about industry participation?
I guess I would just say, and again, obviously the context is going to be very different everywhere. But for Metlakatla, they had gone through all the ways of trying to engage with proponents and governments on these issues and really wasn't finding a lot of traction. And so it was honestly like Metlakatla deciding to go ahead and do this on their own and not consider involvement from those external groups that have now brought those people to the table to talk about some of these topics, and also to participate in the program largely through funding opportunities with industry. But there's another community on the North Coast that has a similar program to ours, and some of the ways that they're engaging with industry is to create the management tables and then to ask proponents to participate in those tables rather than relying on proponents to create their own management plans for things like boat operations in the territory. And I think that's also a model that we're looking to as well. So to create the management plans and then ask those proponents to join us in those plans rather than the reverse, which is kind of typically how it's been done.
That's really novel. I love that. And there's a question in the chat that is kind of a follow-up to that for you, Katerina. You may feel like you've covered some of this, but just to elaborate a little bit, how do you address the community's resistance, or maybe more so, how have they resisted and addressed this, right, to come to the table because they're not being heard, right? Perhaps that's why those systems have been set up or decisions made. But if you want to elaborate on that at all.
Community members' resistance to,
coming to the table because they say they're not being heard, right? So I hear you talking about, constructing and creating alternative tables and being the ones to invite in rather, but if there's any way you want to elaborate on that at all.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was probably not really a challenge for us because the program was always framed as something that was being developed by the community and wasn't, including government and industry. Our biggest challenge is really just the getting over the barriers of the ways that we were talking about these topics. Because at the end of the day, I'm still with like predominantly coming from a Western science worldview and talking about cumulative effects in these like really technical ways. And that just wasn't resonating with community members at the start. And so, which is why I wanted to share that image of the water rippling, because it's really important to like, you know, talk about these things in the ways that make sense for the community. And again, like cumulative effects is how Indigenous communities think about the world, right? They're not thinking about this source impact or this source impact. They're looking at the whole sum of all those effects way and have a much longer time scale of understanding in terms of the past and the future. And so I think those were kind of the barriers, more so learning on our part as like collaborators to get communities more involved. And then what was really important, I think, for members is to actually see like effects from the work, because they are the thing that they're probably the most fatigued by is people coming in, doing studies, collecting data, and they never see anything come from that work, like answering the same questions over and over again about what, you know, whatever it is that, you know, researchers and scientists and others want to know about. And so we may have made a really big effort to just really focus on that action piece rather than the data piece and a lot of the, you know, those complex, like technical studies. And I think that's also what's kind of allowed us to stay engaged with the community.
Thank you so much, Katerina. Leona or members of your team, do you want to chime in? A more general question here, right, that I know you both have been considering is how community engagement was factored into these assessments. Katerina, I think you've addressed that quite well already, and just lessons learned, right? So just in the theme of those questions, right, how community engagement was factored in, Leona, especially if you all want to answer from your perspective.
Sure. So community engagement was a large part of our assessment, especially from the very beginning. We actually initially went on the road and spoke to numerous communities in person. So this is all over California, to talk about the community selection process and to gather additional information for that last prioritization stage. During our process, we set up phone lines for communications. We had one-on-one calls with residents during the pandemic. People in Lost Hills primarily speak Spanish. You may remember that the Cal Enviro screen score was quite high for linguistic isolation. And so we had communications available in Spanish. We had meetings in Spanish. We actually had meetings in Spanish with English translating, which I thought was very cool when I was part of that. Residents also, you know, engaged with us and told us what they wanted to see. They wanted to see, for example, for the source apportionment and the health impact studies. We had in-person meetings to exchange dialogue and to figure out what the community wanted. And we do consider them experts of their community. So to get input, for example, where the monitoring sites and what the mobile routes were, where we were monitoring. And we also had a public comment period for the draft report. So this is where people were able to submit comments, and the community members did, and we are incorporating their input to make our report, as I mentioned earlier, more transparent and address their concerns. So let's see, lessons learned. You know, we liked having that direct feedback about what we can improve in our report and our analyses, and moving forward, we will incorporate, you know, what we've learned at Lost Hills and the other locations. And we're learning to juggle the community expectations with the process to getting the work done. So this kind of came up earlier where, you know, what we want to do and what is asked of us sometimes can't be done right away. So what can we do in our timeframes available? We also learned how important transparency is. Especially regarding the decision-making processes and what our thought process is as we're going through this. And the community engagement overall is very important. We think it helped to keep us accountable too. I think that's about it.
Thank you, Leona. Does anyone else from OEHA or the board want to jump in and mention anything? I have a question in the chat that I think, I don't want to assume that Katerina feels she's already answered this, but this was kind of the core of your whole presentation. So I think this will more so be to Leona and the team. Can you talk about the role of Indigenous knowledges in your project if and how those were used, and any other considerations or lessons learned related to the use of Indigenous knowledges. And of course, after this, Katerina, if you want to jump in and add anything to that, please feel free. But in terms of community engagement in California, was that something that was sought out?
For Indigenous, that's a great question. I think Jonathan or Kathleen, maybe you guys could add here. So I know that we do work closely with Indigenous communities around the state, and that there are many projects that are ongoing where we're working with Indigenous communities to reach their goals, right? To help those communities. For SNAPs, I do not recall if there's a community, an Indigenous community in Kern County right there. Jonathan or Kathleen?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's something, we've heard a few times, and it's something that, was not part of our community selection process back in 2018, but it's something that, we are looking to consider in future community selection as we move forward. So we've selected our first 4 communities for SNAPS monitoring. We're at our 2nd community now, but as we reevaluate that process as we move beyond those 4 communities, that's absolutely something we can work with our tribal engagement folks at CARB on.
Thanks, Jonathan. Katerina, would you like to add anything at this point? I have a more particular question perhaps for you, but please feel free to address anything if you would like.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot I could go into on the topic of Indigenous knowledge. But I guess I would just say that I guess one of the benefits of being able to work with like an Indigenous-led program like this is that that knowledge is really embedded in all of the work that we're doing, and so like one really good example is with the clam value. So as I mentioned, we're doing clam surveys now, and a lot of the stuff that you read about establishing population density and population levels, or understanding population levels, is you need to collect like long-term data, like 10 years of data, to like really parse through that environmental variation. But for us, like we're able to have like a really good understanding of how clam populations have changed over a very long period of time by working with elders and talking to traditional knowledge holders. And we've done that as part of our clam garden project. So we interviewed elders and went through kind of those key time periods and talked about how harvesting has changed, how populations have changed, how do they know. All of that information is really supplementing our understanding of where clam populations are and how they have changed. And so those are things that we're always trying to like explicitly incorporate on specific values. And then also I would say that kind of long-term understanding of the land and the resources really factored into the process of setting management triggers. So people often say you can't do that unless you have long-term quantitative data. But again, like members are coming to those discussions with that knowledge. They have an understanding how things have changed. They know when things are not in a good place versus in a cautionary zone or a standard zone. So again, I think that's really embedded in the work that we're doing because we get to work with the Metlakatla so closely.
Thank you, Katerina. There's a question in the chat that's a follow-up to that specific example that you gave. So if you don't mind, I'll ask you another question. The question is, what action can be taken when an indicator such as clams reaches a hazardous level?
Yeah, and I think it's the biggest challenge of anything that's related to cumulative effects work, is actually like finding ways to target stressors so that you would see an effect in the actual thing that we care about or the values. And so we are, and that's sort of why we're spending so much time, at least for that value, understanding those stressors. And so for right now, butter clams for Metlakatla and for how they feel about where those populations are is in a relatively okay state. Like we would kind of put them in like between the green and the yellow zone. And so we have some space to really think about like what types of actions and policy changes we need to ask for to see things improve for that value. And actually one of the things that Metlakatla can really do on their own, and this is again from understanding how clam populations are from elders, is harvesting actually plays a really big role in population density and how healthy clam populations are. You know, when you go out and dig for clams, you're turning the sand over, you're pulling out those big clams, all of those kinds of things. And so we have focused on trying to increase members' participation in clam harvesting as an action, as a way to kind of improve the productivity of those key beaches. And then our work that's happening on I don't want to take too much time on the contaminant piece versus some of the other stressors is more long-term, as you can imagine. Like seeing some of Leona's work has been really interesting because there's been a lot of questions about being able to figure out the sources of these contaminants and then figuring out how to address those contaminants. And so that's also work that we're starting to do on some of the key contaminants that we have in the territory. And then a lot of it is policy change, right? One of the main issues for clams in Prince Rupert is there is no sewage treatment in the city of Prince Rupert. So you're just having raw sewage coming out into the waters, and that is what's closing beaches to harvest and, you know, creating issues around biological contaminants. That is something that we need to address and work with the city and other levels of government to address. And so anyways, that's sort of the way that we're trying to approach it. But some of them are community level things and some of them are bigger things. And at least with clams, we have some space to kind of like think about our approach and our strategy.
That's excellent. Thank you. I'm trying to we have so many good questions just coming all in here at the end. So I'm trying to do justice to them, folks. Please bear with me. I did have a question for, this is probably mostly for Leona and your team, but Katerina, I think this could also be relevant, especially with what you said about kind of developing parts of the project. But an anonymous attendee asked, are there plans to assess other potential chemicals that this community may be exposed to through their daily activities or jobs? So in the case of California, especially not related to oil and gas wells, though the ports are certainly sources of concern as well for the Metlakatla. If not, are you developing an analytical framework that others, communities, researchers, et cetera, could use to add their assessment of potential exposures to your cumulative exposure analysis? So are there plans for other assessments, especially of other chemicals that might be part of daily life, for example, not related to oil and gas?
Excuse me. Sorry, guys, just when I start to talk. So in this Lost Hills assessment, it is, I think, unique in that we looked at all of the potential exposures. We were monitoring the air in Lost Hills. So if there's any chemicals that are in the air and we had the ability to detect them, then we did, right? So it was, so we don't have plans to go back there other than for, as far as I know at this time, for the acrolein, to try to find the source of the acrolein. But if there were chemicals, so we weren't just looking at the chemicals that came from the oil and gas sources. We were looking at chemicals that came from, you know, the people that drive the cars on the road, and there's, you know, a landfill nearby, and there's natural gas lines, and whatever is in that community that was releasing chemicals into the air. If we had the ability to detect it and we were monitoring for it, then we did detect it. What was the second part of that question?
The second part is if you're developing an analytical framework that others, like communities or researchers, might be able to use to add to their assessment of potential exposures.
I think maybe Jonathan or Kathleen can jump in here, but you could use our work as a framework. I don't know if we're specifically developing a framework, but we tried to be very clear by including a bunch of appendices to our report that show what we did and how we monitored and what equipment we used. You know, for different chemicals, you need different instrumentation to measure.
Mm-hmm.
So, Jonathan or Kathleen, do you have anything to add to that?
I think that covered. I did want to add too, when we do finish revising the report based on public comment from the community and others, we will be releasing the full data set for the Lost Hills analysis as well. So, you know, we encourage agencies, nonprofits, any other groups that want to also analyze the data and use it for, you know, potential action. We encourage that.
Wonderful. So one of the follow-up questions here that's relevant to what you two are talking about, right, is whether or not there are any kinds of interventions that you foresee being considered based on the cumulative impact assessment at Lost Hills in particular.
Yeah, so There could be, some enforcement action, for instance. So we saw the gas processing plant was a very likely source of a lot of pollutants for the Lost Hills community. And with other agencies in the air district to do some inspections of that plant and fix some leaks there. We detected some natural gas leaks in the community through our mobile monitoring, and so those were fixed immediately as well. As we continue to monitor at more communities and get some, if we start to draw some broader conclusions from more than just one community, that could impact, some maybe regulations at our agency, or maybe even amending things like our current oil and gas methane regulation, to incorporate some of these findings that could lead to some broader change.
Thank you. Katerina, I don't want to cut you off if you had anything to add to that. I do have one, we're kind of at our time here. So if I can ask you both to answer one final question in as short or concise a way as possible, as I don't say this question very concisely or shortly, that would be lovely. Just kind of a departing comment on this question that echoes some that we still have left in our chat. How can the findings and lessons from these projects be used to inform policy or address the stressors that have been identified, right? So both of you have talked about this a little bit in some of your responses, but just maybe one way or two ways that the findings and lessons can be used to inform policy or address those stressors.
I can go first. So from a community perspective, we provided information to the community so they can use that information for their own advocacy. That's one thing. But eventually with more communities, so this is one community, we have one very large data set. But with more communities and more very large data sets, we may be able to identify trends and then be able to inform policy that way. Yeah, so for shorter term, as we mentioned, we plan to monitor for the acrolein because we realize we need more information. And we're working to improve technology to get a quicker response from the instruments. And then we can take more measurements. So that's a shorter term. And also shorter term, there were some of these chemicals that we detected don't have health guidance values. And so, or cancer potency values. The health guidance value is what is considered a safe exposure level, or excuse me, an exposure that will not cause health effects, right? So we do at OEHA, we do develop those. So we are looking into that and the cancer potency factor, for example, for acrolein. And then another thing that will happen, so we don't necessarily inform policy directly, but when we release this data set and then with the release of subsequent data sets, this information can be used by anyone, including people who may have the authority to make larger policy decisions.
Thank you, Leona. Katerina, did you want to add, please?
Yeah, I guess the way that I would answer that question is, I think through this work, what we're seeing is a really big gap in strategic direction. So there's really like nothing that is being provided by the government to guide decisions about major projects and activities that are the sources of a lot of these stressors. And that's really where I think the Metlakatla program is kind of really pushing that idea forward. We're seeing so many other, Indigenous communities creating their own cumulative effects programs. We have many examples now of Indigenous-led impact assessment, and governments have created space in those legislations to allow for those assessments to basically replace the state-led processes. And I think what we really like to see is almost like a going back to some of those basics of like really good land use planning and marine use planning. And we are at least seeing that in BC right now with the revitalization of the Lands Act and things like that. And I think from all the communities that I've had an opportunity to work with and talk with, that is kind of the message I keep hearing, is that we need some direction. We need to have goals. We need to have things that are telling us when there's too much impact or there's too much activity in an area. And that's really what's going to make a big impact in preventing cumulative impacts into the future. And so that's sort of, I think, where our work can really support policy changes if it can.
Thank you. Thank you both. These projects, we have several comments in the chat and just how inspiring your projects are and how important this kind of dedication to really looking at the holistic kind of picture of things is. So I wanted to pass along that those compliments from our audience. I want to thank you both and your teams for the work that you've done and for sharing with us. Thank you to our audience for attending this webinar by HEI on cumulative impacts. The webinar will be available on HEI's website in the coming weeks. We'll be hosting our next webinar at the end of June, focusing on methods for cumulative impact assessment. Stay tuned for the announcement, please. You can sign up for updates from the Energy and Health program at the link listed here. Lastly, please complete the feedback survey in the chat and in the follow-up email we are sending later on. We appreciate your feedback and hope you will join us for our next webinar. Thank you again to our panelists and participants and to HEI for organizing this. Thank you all for being here as well.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.